Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Brainwaves webinar on teaching about mental health and well-being. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Tracy, I'm from Brainwaves, and I shall be your host for this afternoon. So the aim of today is to have an informed discussion about best practice when it comes to teaching mental health and well-being in schools, particularly secondary schools. And I'm delighted to welcome our panel of speakers here today to discuss this. So firstly, we have Thomas Godfrey Fawcett, who is a doctoral researcher and teaching fellow at the University of Oxford's Department of Education. Tom has been leading the work we've been doing in evaluating the brainwaves lessons so far, and he'll be able to talk a little bit more about that later. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
And from a teaching perspective, we're delighted to be joined by Gavin English, who is Deputy Head Pastoral at Elaine School in London, and Danny Ethorn, who is the designated mental health lead at the Christopher Whitehead Language College in Worcester. Hello both to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
And finally joining us on the panel is Julian Turner, Director of Education here at Brainwaves. Hello, Julian.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, so this is the guidelines that we share at the start of every Brainwaves lesson. And there's two sort of main drivers behind these type of guidance. And the first one is encouraging everybody to be respectful, to be kind to each other, to listen, and to not judge or be derogatory or to put anybody down. So that's very much a strong vein in the first line. And the second one is to sort of to contribute, to be curious, to ask questions, and to give everybody a chance to speak. But I think one of the key things is that we also say that within the topic of mental health is that you don't have to say anything if you don't want to. You don't have to talk about yourself and you don't have to contribute. So I just wanted to very quickly bring Danny and Gavin in at this point to see if these sort of guidelines resonate with anything that you do within your teaching of mental health. Danny, have you got anything to share about this sort of approach?
I think it's just really important that you do this and you do it at the start of each lesson that you deliver. So just because the students have seen it once, don't take it for granted that they will remember these things, and trying to set up each lesson as you would with any lesson. Quite often you come in and you have a starter on the board. It's that starter, it's sort of keying the students into these are the expectations, and this is what we expect from you and from one another when listening to each other. I think it's still a subject that not everyone's very comfortable with either delivering or being a part of. So having those really clear, safe spaces set up makes it more comfortable for the students and more comfortable for you as a staff member, knowing that your students have those expectations to follow, really.
Yeah. And is there anything additional that you do to try and create that learning environment, that feels safe and respectful?
I'd say nothing additional, but perhaps it's very easy to put the PowerPoint slide up at the start of a lesson. It may be harder to remember to enforce the rules during the lesson. So if someone has made a comment, even if you maybe don't think, oh, well, they're not really being rude, but I'm not sure that was the kindest comment, sort of picking it up there and then in the middle of the conversation. Don't be afraid of stopping the flow of a discussion or debate to address someone making a comment that maybe they haven't thought through or don't realise the connotations behind what they're saying. Making sure that you've picked that up there and then. And I think students really appreciate knowing that, okay, it's not just expectations that were put up at the start, but they are being followed through every lesson, and making sure that they're enforced, really.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Gavin, I know you teach some of these lessons at Elaine's. Is there any approach that you take to, making sure that it's a safe space for young people to contribute to?
Yeah, I think Danny spoke really eloquently about that. I think just stepping back a little bit, look, all of your schools will have your own sort of set of school values or fundamental principles that you hold the kids to. I think it can be really helpful just to kind of contextualize the guidelines, which I think are great. I think they're really I think the Brainwaves guidelines are fundamentally sort of values led, which I think is really helpful. So contextualizing those in your own school values and reminding them of how this stuff links to their sort of day-to-day sort of existence at school, I think is important as well as drawing particular attention to why this stuff matters in these lessons particularly. I also think you'll have your own systems, right, about how you set up classroom, your own stuff in terms of like classroom management you can reinforce. The one thing I would say about these guidelines is that some of this stuff can be really proactive. So being kind is not necessarily a passive piece. Contributing is not passive. Like the listening piece can be really active. Asking questions and demonstrating curiosity can be something that students engage with. So rewarding those, praising those pieces, like when people demonstrate that, I think is a really, really good mechanism. I think PSHE, RSE sessions, particularly sessions around mental health, the likelihood is that there's a little bit of sort of nervousness or sort of energy in the room that might be a little bit unusual for the kids because you're discussing things that are slightly, I guess, different contextually to some of the stuff they're doing in terms of their lessons. You think about a brainwaves lesson sitting in the middle of a school day, it could feel quite different to the other sessions they've been in around it. So creating a positive atmosphere around the guidelines, rewarding children who live up to them and holding that up to them, I think is, I'm conscious of the fact that we all understand how we use rewards in our spaces. But I do think in this particularly tying it back to your school values, making sure they understand that it's contextually relevant to them, and then thinking about how you kind of recognize and hold people up who demonstrate that kindness or have listened really well to someone else, or even who seek clarification, right? Like that sort of thing in this context. Any kid who's speaking in that way, I think it's a pretty bold thing. So early on in those lessons, in the runner lessons, getting behind the kids on that bit and letting them know that you're looking for those behaviours, I think is a pretty good move.
Julian, you're nodding. Anything you would like to add there? Or... Julian?
No, I didn't want to add anything. I was just agreeing. Really, it's sort of I think one of the key things is for students to understand that this is something that that is relevant to them. So for some people, it may regard it as a sort of a little topic on the side or something that is, mental health is a thing or a negative thing that happens to certain people, and they may or may not be one of those people. And I think there's a sort of, instead, we're just trying to create an environment where we're trying to talk to each other and understand all of our roles and influences in mental health. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So some other guidance that we put out, and I will say that on our website, which is education.brainwaves.org, that we put out, there's lots of blogs and information about teaching wellbeing and mental health. But we do encourage teachers to be sensitive to the personal background and lived experiences of the students. The idea that many of them could be experiencing distressing mental health situations, and these sort of lessons could trigger, but could be triggering for them. So, trying to work on the idea that at least one person in your class may be vulnerable, make sure that you have safe delivery for all. And one of the ways that we suggest you do this is through the use of case studies or scenarios, using the third person, not the first person, so that person doesn't have to relate to their own situations. Is depersonalizing something that you use, Danny, in your work, in your teaching in this area?
Yeah, definitely. So anytime we're presenting, we're always presenting scenarios and case studies. We're never saying like, oh, that teacher down the corridor, they've dealt with this situation. But also, like you said, making sure you've got in your head that there could be a student in front of you dealing with something. I think at the moment it's 1 in 4 under 14-year-olds will have some sort of mental health or well-being issue that they're dealing with. So in a class of 28, that's 7 students who are definitely going to have something going on in front of you. So I think definitely not making it personal, but my personal approach is that I will occasionally reference things I'm comfortable talking about that have maybe affected me in my life, so that students see that I'm a person and that it is affecting people that they know. But certainly when delivering lessons and talking about maybe the harder hitting issues, making sure that I'm using the case studies and scenarios that have been provided, and before students are invited to maybe share their experiences or share something, that I remind them before they start speaking, almost, that okay, you're not talking about a person who you know necessarily. Let's try and keep it vague, because obviously rumours go around schools and things, don't they? So quite often, if a student's talking about a thing that's happened, lots of people will know who they're talking about. So like you said, trying to keep it vague in third person, whilst balancing with the fact that it is normal and it is okay to have experienced these things. It's a fine line, I think.
It's a fine line, absolutely. And Tom, just to bring you in here, what about modeling good wellbeing strategy yourself as a teacher? Is that a helpful strategy?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really, really valuable. I think many of us go into teaching primarily, initially at least, from a more kind of like academic subject-based background, and we would never really think of teaching without using modeling. It is such an important tool in the way that we teach when it comes to our academic subjects. As a physics teacher, I would constantly be modeling answers. I'm really careful about the language that I use to express myself and the precision of that language. And I think in the kind of mental health and well-being sphere, it's exactly the same. The way that we model our behaviors and our strategies and how we cope with unforeseen circumstances and stress is really, really important. In particular, thinking about the brainwaves lessons and the topics that are covered, I think the way in which we hold discussions, and we've talked about this a lot already, both Gavin and Danny, but the way in which we model listening, the way in which we model asking people questions and active listening and being respectful is really, really important. And I think we'll talk maybe also later about the language that we use. And then finally, just looking a bit at the literature between the way that student mental health correlates with teacher mental health. In the UK, and maybe this is a poor reflection on the state of the UK teaching profession in general, but in the UK, there's a lot of evidence for poor teacher mental health impacting student mental health. So we see teachers who report feeling burnt out or feeling stressed or anxious have student cohorts who report feeling the same. In the UK, there's unfortunately less good evidence about good teacher mental health, but if we go global, there is evidence about the reverse as well. So teachers who report feeling generally well and having good coping strategies, having good mechanisms for supporting their own mental health and well-being, their pupils also tend to report the same. And so as a broader picture, understanding your own mental health as a teacher is really, really crucial, and building on your own repertoire of kind of strategies and mechanisms for which you help yourself feel well, and then modeling that for students is really integral.
I mean, I guess that raises an interesting question, Gavin. If you don't feel like you're, in a particularly strong place mentally yourself, how you cope with that as a teacher.
I think that, to that point, I think it is Tom, I think spot on, actually. I think if we can model that we are particularly reflective about our mental health and how we're doing at a particular time, where we are on our curve of kind of like on the way up, on the way down. I said to you guys before the webinar started, it feels like a Monday. Like it feels like the end of a Monday. It's all right to hold that up to kids, right? There is nothing wrong with going into a room and being like, you know what, I need to top my sleep up. I have not slept well for a couple of nights. I'm going to go to bed early tonight. That is a really straightforward, we have a brainwaves lesson on sleep, how important that is. It's a really straightforward way of modeling that for kids. I need to get that bit right. I just need a good night's sleep. Everything will be okay. Everything will feel better if I can get my head on a pillow. And I'm not being reductive about that. I also think the way we speak about this stuff with young people is really important. If we want to young people to engage and to open up, and if we want to destigmatize like discussions around mental health, there can be a temptation, I think, and I completely understand it, because it can feel, a lot of people are doing this stuff outside of their comfort zone. They might not feel confident. There can be a trepidation and a wariness and a caution that can, feel a little bit heavy. If we can try and keep this light, and we can keep it up here in terms of our delivery when we're working with children, and we upbeat and isn't this interesting, and then we're going to lead them to a different type of mentality towards discussing this stuff. I think Danny had a really good example, spoke really nicely about examples, and it's not about being reductive about this stuff, but sometimes if you can keep the examples and the scenarios on the lighter end of the scale, but still speak about the intervention, really in a more informed way, and then the kids will land it anyway. So, you know, it might be that the thing is causing me worry and concern is really heavy, but it might also be that I've given myself a really bad haircut and I'm anxious and I'm apprehensive about that, right? Okay. My strategies in terms of managing that and how I'm dealing with it are just as transferable. And then, of course, it's just about holding up that obviously, you know, we might be worried, we're not over pathologizing, I'm not being reductive about it, but we're not going to talk about something really, really heavy in front of you all, but the strategies might be the same. Do you see what I mean? So you will know your kids in front of you better than anyone else. But I think if you can keep it up here, that will help. And that modelling piece, Tom, right, on point. You know, letting kids know, today has been a rough one. Like, you know, that is all right. You know, that is okay. And half the time, I mean, there'll be some that will take advantage, I'm sure, but half the time, like, the kids will be on your side as a result of that as well. And I think they appreciate it. So I think that's what I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gavin. So just to pick up then on what Tom and Gavin have both mentioned about language, Danny, I know that you sort of quite passionate about the use of language when talking about mental health. Can you tell us a bit more about this and some of the examples that you would suggest?
Yeah, I have a really big passion for sort of the language people use and how it's interpreted and what is meant sometimes when people speaking. And I remember one bit of training I had with regards to talking to students one-to-one or as a group about mental health or something they are going through. Someone told me to try and not use the phrase "I understand." And that's something I used to use all the time. Like, yeah, I understand how you're feeling, but there is absolutely no way that we can understand how these young people are feeling. And just rephrasing that to, I hear you, or I can empathize with what you might be going through, makes the students feel a bit more validated. Because if we just say, I understand, it almost takes away from whatever they've just shared with you, whatever they've shared with the room in a discussion. We can't possibly understand all the nuances of what they are going through. We're not the same age as them. We're not in the exact same social bubble with the same family makeup. So that was one of my key takeaways, that every time now I have that one-to-one discussion with a student, I'm trying to think, right, don't use the phrase "I understand." What can I say that makes them feel heard and validated? And I think in a lot of ways it is just they want someone to listen to them and to feel heard. A lot of counselling techniques do, certainly a lot of person-centred techniques focus on sort of echoing back what that person has said. So if you repeat back to a student, so you said about your mum not having dinner on the table for you, can you tell me more about that? And kind of echoing back the point they've made so that they can then elaborate on it, makes them feel heard, make them feel listened to, and it adds to that safe space and environment. So I definitely agree with what's been said by Tom and Gavin as well about the sort of modelling, and again, that models a good conversation for them. If you can model well, actually being a good listener and a good friend is sort of not assuming you know everything, not assuming you know all the answers, and ask them. There's been plenty of times when I've said to a young person, would you like my advice or do you want me to just listen right now? And I think that can work wonders as well. Even if they just want to sit there in quiet and write it down instead. There's different ways of communicating, so it doesn't always have to be language based. They might feel they can write their thoughts down much better than they can speak to you, but that is still a valid way of communication for a lot of our young people, and it might actually lead to other conversations later down the line.
Absolutely.
I think that's I think that's spot on. I think we shouldn't underestimate a young person's ability to feel like you're talking down to them. I think, you know, if they're coming into that space to have that conversation with you, or even in that classroom, if they're sharing that, they're going to be there's a possibility they're feeling quite vulnerable anyway. I completely agree with that. I understand it. There was, empathy useful, sympathy not so much. And I think also just recognizing it, and we'll talk about this maybe later, but just recognizing that actually as teachers, they don't necessarily come to us because they expect us to have all the answers all the time. Like, do you see what I mean? Sometimes it is just that I want to get it out and I want to say it. And you know what? Amazingly, like, Danny, that example you gave is a really good one, but that, oh wow, what did you do about that, is sometimes the best question. Like, how was that for you? Like, what went on there then? How did that play out? Is a really good question to ask, because they might tell you what they did about it and feel vindicated and like they've, and then they've been recognised for that. So I think, I think that's a really, really good point, actually. Just a, I suppose, virtual high five.
I think that's great advice, Danny. As well, and I would, if anyone's interested in sort of in going more deeply into that, I'd really recommend the work of David Grove around clean language, which is sort of helps you to be aware of the way that people use metaphors and can lead you to think you understand what someone is saying, when actually they're what they need help in sort of unpacking their metaphors and explaining, and, as you say, rightly being heard. So I'd really recommend that. I'll put a link in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you for raising that. The idea that teachers aren't supposed to, have the answers to everything. And so I think in that respect, having clear referral pathways to support the teachers in knowing what to do, and, signposting students to the right information and support is really important as well. A real key part about teaching mental health. Gavin, I know that you sort of have, there's a few things that might help mitigate some of the risks about teaching mental health, in terms of the quality of the lessons that you might try and look to or use. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, okay.
Leading question, I guess.
Being super adaptive, use brainwaves, right? But the fundamental reason why we would use brainwaves content is it's reliable. Yeah. So we know where it's come from. We know what the foundation of it is. We know what the motivations are behind it. We get all that stuff. And there is risk when we're teaching around stuff in mental health and well-being. And there is a lot of content out there. Some resources, have a less secure evidence base. Some resources oversimplify, or even, like, at the other end of the scale, like, worse still, sort of can sensationalize sort of mental health conditions. Obviously, the brainwave stuff is really carefully put together in consultation with a lot of different people. There is other stuff though, like, check out the NHS stuff. Make sure you're looking at, like, Anna Freud, like, Centre, see whether it aligns with DfE guidance. You just got to be careful of that, because some activities, discussions, some of the case studies and the bits and bobs that are out there, like, can lead people into slightly therapeutic conversations. That always makes me nervous. If any content is really really directive, you should probably absolutely be checking that up against, like, other organisations and seeing whether that's sound. I think also cultural sensitivity is important. Your context of your school could be quite different to another one. So think carefully about your particular context that you're in, and think about whether or not different resources or different content that you're sharing is the right fit for your community and who you're working with. I think brainwaves, without just talking this up a bit, like over talking out, but it's a free resource and people should be using it because it's solid in terms of its research base. I think it does a really good job of being accessible and applicable to a wide range of different people. And the other thing is, like, is it age appropriate? I've seen some content that has been dropped at, effectively pushed as, like, key stage 3 stuff that kind of you think, whoa, hold on a minute, and you want to kind of sense check whether that is going on. So there are potentially a lot of pitfalls around the resources that I think that are available. And I think, I'm not being cynical, like, to the point of suggesting anyone is in it other than to try and do good, and it's coming from a good place. But you just have to be really aware of the fact that if you're putting stuff like this in front of kids, you better have checked the age appropriateness of it. You better have checked that it aligns in terms of its inclusivity and its appropriateness for your audience. And I would run it up against some of those like really rock solid organisations that you know about, Young Minds, you know, Mind, NHS, Anna Freud, you know, the DFE, just to make sure that you're really comfortable with it. And, you know, with obviously we all plan our delivery of all PSHE, RSE and content really, really carefully. But if you are nervous about that, like, or you're just up against it a little bit, having a go-to like Brainwaves, I think is really, really helpful. Like being able to grab some of that stuff and just having that as a go-to, I think is really useful. And also I am conscious of the fact that the people joining this are people that have made a conscious decision to either be more informed or to develop their knowledge around this space. You know, not every teacher in the school is necessarily that. So if we're going to be asking colleagues to deliver this content, we really have got to be careful that we're not, for want of a better word, like hanging them out to dry, putting things out in front, you know, putting them out with resources and putting them in front of kids that they can't be completely confident and comfortable with. So I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about that at the moment because, you know, I get bombed with content and some of it is great, but a lot of it I look at and I'm kind of like, okay, maybe not. That pop psychology or unverified statistics are there are many of those about at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really seamless segue really into Tom, coming to you to just talk a little bit about teacher confidence and what you found out from the research into the Brainwaves lessons about teacher confidence, and that exactly that thing that Gavin mentioned, you know, just people being asked to teach this sort of stuff with you know, with not much levels of confidence. And yeah, if you are able to share some of the findings.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the context of you know, PHSE generally or mental health and wellbeing education in schools is often that teachers feel either that it's not something that they've received specific training for, or even in some cases that it falls outside of their remit as subject teachers. And I think there's a really important and interesting discussion to be had there. I would super strongly agree with everything that Gavin has just said. I think it is, and it can be quite a nerve-wracking environment to be in as a teacher, particularly given the sense that there are mistakes that can be made. It's not a case where good intentions are enough in some of the cases. And I think that recognizing that there is an increasing body of research out there is really valuable. And that can sometimes be hard to navigate yourself and in kind of time constricted times. So I think having evidence-based, reliable resources is something that can build teacher confidence and teacher trust. It's credible, you can rely on it, your students feel that they kind of can buy into it and believe in it. And there's a sense that this is something that we can rely on. I think also just to kind of go back a little bit to what both Gavin and Danny were saying earlier and kind of link it into this teacher confidence thing. I think there's an increasing body of evidence that mental health style lessons in schools that focus on normalizing a full range of human emotions, recognizing that being mentally well doesn't mean kind of smiling and being happy 100% of the time, all day, every day, is really valuable. And we see there are interventions that have been trialed in schools that are kind of overly restricted or overly focused on diagnosable disorders or painting a kind of negative picture, in the worst case, as Gavin said, glamorizing, that can have harm. Whereas school-based approaches that are more universal, that target the entire student body, and that broadly take quite a positive approach. You know, we think of approaches that are proactive, protective, and positive, that focus on kind of thinking forward, thinking about steps that you can take and strategies that you can have, are generally, you know, quite safe approaches to take. And there's a growing body of evidence that these are kind of pretty good across the board for all students in the class. And so I think that's something that teachers can rely on. It's a kind of safer space to be in. And I particularly like the example that Gavin was giving about bad haircut. You know, I think we can model these in quite like proactive and, you know, positive spaces. You can very easily see that discussion being quite lighthearted and quite fun, quite inclusive for the group, but also dealing with some important issues about strategies that you have that are protective, that are going to be kind of helping you react to kind of stressful situations in the event that a situation is more stressful than that, perhaps. Although, you know, bad haircuts can be very, very stressful, no doubt. But yeah, I think for me, I think as a teacher myself, like relying on sources that I trust, there's nothing that I find less empowering as a teacher than being given a set of slides to teach that I find that I don't buy into. That is so disempowering. And I hate doing it. My pupils notice that I'm not into it. We have reports of students who say, it felt like the teacher was just reading things off the slide that they didn't enjoy from a range of studies. And having teachers feel that they can trust something, buy into it, breeds confidence. And then you feel you've got a really solid foundation upon which to have a discussion. And even if later on in the discussion you feel you're out of your comfort zone, at least you have that secure foundation to fall back on, which I think is really, really valuable.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Julian, leading on from this, Tom mentioned, that sort of protective need of education. For those people who aren't aware of the PERMA framework, are you able to give a little bit of an overview of what that is and how it underpins the lessons that we put out on wellbeing and why we chose that approach?
Yeah, so as Tom was saying, we definitely did not want to create lessons that were focused on conditions, mental illness, specific mental conditions, because we did not want young people trying to self-diagnose themselves or thinking what it is that they have got or have not got. And instead, we wanted to do something that was very, very positive, that is well evidenced, and we therefore, with the guidance of our colleagues at Oxford and the Department of Psychiatry, we based all of the lessons around the principles of positive psychology as founded by Martin Seligman around about 25 years ago. And in particular, he developed a framework. So PERMA is an acronym for to explain that happiness and well-being are not just about mood or not just about how you're feeling, although that is part of it. So there are 5 elements to PERMA: positive emotion, engagement, which we might also think of as being flow type activities where you're really focused on something, relationships, which are incredibly important, particularly for young people learning about developing positive ways to have relationships, and meaning and purpose, that's the M of PERMA, and finally accomplishment, which sort of includes the area of self-efficacy, so young people feeling like they have some ability to convert their goals into reality. So all of those things together make up the PERMA framework, and there's lots about it. I saw that our colleague Tara very helpfully put a link to the Brainwaves lessons in the chat, and there is also, we did an earlier webinar on this, which is also linked to in the chat.
Thank you. And Gavin, I know you're a big fan of the PERMA framework too. Can you expand on how you use PERMA throughout your school? Because I know you use it in a variety of ways. Oh, you're on mute there, Gavin.
Someone has to do it, right? We've been using it for about 4 years now. Yeah, I really like it because it is an adaptable scaffold that retains its efficacy and also retains its sort of basis and research in lots of different contexts. So that message, our kids at Allains know and understand PERMA, at a fairly sort of fundamental level. It sits in the middle of all our wellbeing piece. We pitch it exactly. Thomas referenced this, and Tom, you referenced this, and Julian has spoken about this before. We use it as a positive, proactive approach to wellbeing and mental health. So we use it in a way that as we ask children to invest in their PERMA. So it's their kind of mental fitness, it's their maintenance piece of work. So we talk about it in terms of, making sure they're finding time for positive emotion. Are they seeking out that thing that brings them flow that they can really plug into and engage with? We get them to reflect on their relationships and reflect on how they're contributing to other people, like how they're impacting positively other people's PERMA. We talk to them about that sense of belonging and being part of something that is kind of bigger than themselves, and where's their contribution to community. And then also, at a really superficial level, we throw out as many high fives as we can for lots of different things, but also we ask children about what they're most proud of achieving quite a lot. And that sounds like something that is that will happen in assemblies. I did a whole assembly on the non-league football club that I run and how that feeds my PERMA, despite being quite hard work, how that really, really gives me sort of that, how that ticks all those boxes. But equally, the really attractive thing about it is that every kid can use that scaffold to kind of demonstrate how they're working on their own well-being, how they have agency and control over what their well-being looks like. What feeds my perma may not be the same, Tracy, as what feeds yours. They may be two really, really different things. But that scaffold is a way for you to frame that for yourself and for other people, and for me to do the same. So we use it, like the most recent way that we're starting to use it is we have trained all our student mentors. So we do coaching training. So we train our sixth formers in coaching, and then they go out and they're available for like day to day. It's called All Good Mentors. So they have like a day to day, I keep losing my textbook and this teacher's going to be costing me. They have like coach-like conversations to help kids with them. But now, if they feel like kids are coming to them because they're not, they've got some sort of impacted stuff, or they're feeling a bit sad or a bit miserable, it's not about trying to be therapeutic, but the questions the kids run through are, oh, tell us something that's been a laugh. What are you doing for fun at the moment? Oh, tell me about what your interests are. What are you into? How are your mates? How's that going? It's just a good conversation piece for those older students to have with younger ones. And if they feel like a kid hasn't got an answer, or a kid gives an answer that worries them a little bit, they know that's immediately a point where they can then refer. So that is a really straightforward way that we're using it. It's just an easily accessible scaffold, I think, for young people to talk about their well-being in a positive and proactive way. And obviously the plus in PERMA, which we don't talk about here, sleep. Think about your sleep. Think about your diet, not just what you eat, but what gets beamed through your eyeballs to the back of your brain. And also, your exercise. Are you doing something? Are you doing something to get your heart rate up and to jump around? Then, you kind of got a really easily accessible package there. So I think alongside all the other really great stuff that Brainwaves talks about and that is out there, I just think it's just a really, really good, straightforward scaffold that can be used. I'd encourage everyone, you've got the lesson in the link, just have a look at it. And the great thing about it is, and Martin Seligman and his crew, the iPen lot, might get really cross about it, but the great thing about it is that actually you can adjust it. You can flex it to fit your context actually quite nicely without losing any of the real value that's in it.
Amazing. That's awesome, Gavin. Thank you so much. I'm just really looking at a question from Catherine, which is a really good question. Thank you, Catherine. It's about assessing well-being or PSHE sessions, how you might best do that. Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think assessment is really interesting in education generally, like across the board, both in academic subjects and in PHSE. I think a couple of useful categorizations, almost binaries, or really spectra that we can think about when you think about assessment is what that assessment is used for. So we talk about assessment being used either for people processing, kind of sorting people, or people changing, thinking about ways in which the assessment itself can be geared towards change. And also assessment that is either convergent, we're broadly trying to get everyone to the same place, thinking of kind of summative exams, GCSE A-level type stuff, or divergent assessment where we accept that everyone is going in different places and wants to be in different places. So I think trying to use those two categorizations to think about what we're trying to get out of our assessment is really valuable here. For me, this is a classic example where we're looking for assessment that is more towards the people changing than the people processing end of the spectrum. We don't want to be getting to a stage where we can rank people and say, you are kind of doing these things at an A grade, whereas you're only doing these things at a B grade. That feels to me slightly off-putting. And then also accepting that we want things to be more divergent. So forms of assessment that fit into more kind of people changing or divergent ends of the spectrum are things like kind of portfolio type work, project type work, with a emphasis on things like self-assessment, peer assessment. And I think in this instance, self-assessment in particular is a really valuable reflective tool that can be used as part of that. So for me, when we're looking at trying to bring in assessment, and I think recognizing that assessment is an integral part of teaching, but in this case, that assessment needs to be less kind of top down, less imposed on pupils, and more kind of bottom up, more convergent, more divergent, sorry. And so thinking about these mechanisms where students can, it's more about asking students, what can you do, rather than checking if you can do something, if you see what I mean. It's what can you do rather than can you do this thing that I have in mind.
Tracy, can I bring in, there's another question that's
Yeah, of course, please
in
do.
the chat from Russell, so asking how we can capture the impact of the PSHE curriculum or the Brainwaves curriculum, and how do we know that students have retained the important information. So I'm just going to just shamelessly plug the fact that Brainwaves is not just an education program. It's not just these lessons we make available. It's also a research program. So we have now a growing network, over 60 schools in the country are part of our Brainwaves Research Schools Partnership Network. And in those schools, young people are actually answering a set of questions and taking part in our growing cohort of students. And one of the very, very interesting things that we found in that is actually we found a connection between young people's sense of agency and their sense of well-being. Now we don't know how that works. We're not saying that's one is causing the other, but we think it's a very interesting area. And so in this summer term, we're actually recruiting schools at Key Stage 3 level to take part in a randomized controlled trial of a set of 6 Brainwaves lessons. And that's Russell, that's exactly designed to answer the question that you're asking. And what we're going to be looking at is 4 different levels of impact. So one is to the extent to which students are retaining some of the key bits of information. Secondly, whether they're able to we've helped to give them a structure or a way of thinking about it, a conceptual approach or vocabulary, a bit like Gavin was talking about with using PERMA. And then thirdly, whether there's any changes in behavior as a result, and fourthly, whether there are any changes in well-being. And in terms of changes in behavior and attitudes, one of the key things we're looking for is whether there is any change in young people's sense that they themselves have a role to play in their own well-being. And I would just say, if there's just one thing that comes out of teaching these lessons, is that if you can get that sense that from the young people that they have a role to play themselves, that is it's a great start. It may not be the whole thing, but it's a great start. So that, assessing that is one of the things we're going to be doing in the summer. And if you want to take part in that, then do let us know. Stick it in the chat and we'll be delighted to talk to you about it.
Amazing. Well, that takes us nicely up to 5 o'clock. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Hopefully you can join us at another Brainwaves webinar soon. We've got one on creativity and well-being coming up in October. So we hope you can join us for that. Thank you again, panel. And until that, we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.